Thanks for joining once again. Recently, in the last while, one of the political topics that the news is covering revolves around the carbon tax that's going up tomorrow, I believe. And there's, of course, disagreement about some of those things, and various media sources are covering it. One that caught my attention was the Toronto Star had an article that was entitled, Pierre Poilievre says one thing, 200 experts refute it. Who to believe? Well, that's certainly an attention-grabbing headline. But as we often find out, everything isn't always as it seems. Now, that certainly was true in the time of Jesus, where the top experts from the judiciary system, the legal, religious, political systems, they had this story about the resurrection of Jesus. They said it didn't happen. That, in fact, their story that they pushed, that people believed, that at least Scripture recognizes that many believed, was the fact that the disciples had snuck in while the soldiers slept, and they had stolen the body. That the resurrection was a hoax. And there's a YouTube video done by Babylon Bee that's entitled "If Jesus' Resurrection Were a Hoax," that show just how I just want to say the lunacy of this idea. And it's a piece of satire that gives you a flavor of the implications, what that really meant if that happened. And certainly there's a number of different reasons to suggest that the disciples didn't make it up. We know that they were scared. We know that if you were going to write a good story in that time, you wouldn't start out with women as the chief witnesses, if you will, because in that time, in that culture, their witness wouldn't be sort of admissible. And then they portray themselves as scared, spineless men, hiding out, betraying, abandoning everything that would be seen as shameful. And certainly for the disciples, for the women, it wasn't a headline. It was an experience that they gradually, in some ways, came to embrace, in the sense that for some it was sort of a process of a couple, 2, 3 appearances or being told about it that started to swing their understanding to believe something, of course, that had never happened before. So it's understandable that they would be hesitant. And I wanted to read from Mark chapter 16, but before, at the same time as we say, in some ways, like I like to say that it was seen, the resurrection was seen as a conspiracy theory. That's how it was pushed in terms of the legal experts. Oh, that's just a conspiracy theory. But it's one of those conspiracy theories that proved out true. Now, just to say, though, it is true that the 4 gospel accounts of the resurrection contain various differences in recorded details. For example, the number and the names of the women who came to the tomb, or the number of angelic messengers who appeared, or the women's reaction to the resurrection announcement. There's some differences in these 4 different accounts, like you would see in eyewitness accounts. When the story is too pretty, it's probably not true. When it's too packaged. And certainly for the disciples and for the women, it was something more shared from person to person. And even the writers of the Gospels got their information from other people. including Mark, who would have had, as we talked about before, Peter was probably his main source. And of course, Peter was there for some of that stuff, and others he would have heard from other people. And they shared it with Mark. And I wanted to begin, we recognize there are some differences, I think because of their sources. I think also that the writers had not only the different eyewitness sources, but they recorded their stories in ways that were consistent with their writing styles and their purpose. And one of the things that Mark does is he just sort of chops it off. He's just going along and then boom, he's done. And we're left, hey, wanting some more. And that's why somewhere along, maybe a 2nd century or later, there's a portion in that they sort of added like a summary at the end of, somebody did, and maybe there's more than a couple of people that gave a shot at that to summarize what had happened after. And it's been largely recognized that chunk of writing wasn't Mark. And so I wanted to read that from Mark chapter 16. When the Sabbath was over, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James and Salome, brought spices so that they might go to anoint Jesus' body. Very, very early on the first day of the week, just after sunrise, they were on their way to the tomb, and they asked each other, "Who will roll the stone away from the entrance of the tomb?" But when they looked up, they saw that the stone, which was very large, had been rolled away. As they entered the tomb, they saw a young man dressed in a white robe, sitting on the right side, and they were alarmed. And he said, "Don't be alarmed," he said. "You are looking for Jesus the Nazarene, who was crucified. He has risen. He is not here. See the place where they've laid him. But go, tell his disciples and Peter, he is going ahead of you into Galilee. There you will see him, just as he told you." Trembling and bewildered, the women went out and fled from the tomb. They said nothing to anyone because they were afraid. And so prior to this, Mark tells us about how Christ is being crucified. The curtain in the temple is torn from top to bottom, and the curtain that separated the Holy of Holies where God was from the people. And that's split. An illustration of now we have direct access to God through Jesus. That Jesus makes that possible. And then the story goes on to tell us that there's a centurion watching, and he sees Jesus die, an expert in death. And he recognizes that Jesus dies, and he makes this statement that Mark wants us to get. Surely this man was the Son of God. And all of this time, right through all of this story, in the story of who's afraid, the women are the only ones that have been there. Perhaps at a distance, but they're the only ones that haven't been running away. All the guys, they fled. Or they were trying to get Jesus. But in this case, so the women have been watching, they've seen him buried. But before he gets buried, right, there is one guy that stands out. And perhaps if you look at another account, there's two. And they're from the top level, you might say, of power, the Sanhedrin. We read about Joseph of Arimathea, and I believe Nicodemus is from that same place. And it reads that Joseph approached Pilate for the body, and Pilate was surprised. Jesus already dead, and he checked it out. Yes, he was dead. And so Joseph has the body taken down, and I like how Mark doesn't record it as Jesus being taken down. It's the body that's taken down and put in this tomb. And then we have, so the body is buried or in the tomb prior to Friday at sundown, because when sundown happens, we're into the Sabbath day, which would be Saturday. And then, of course, that ends at sundown on Saturday, the Sabbath, and then the Sunday begins at sundown and continues on. And so we have, when you count them the way the Jewish did, Jesus would have been in the grave 3 days. And I just mentioned that because some people will go, well, they would only count 2. But the way they would count it there would be on Friday he was there, and Saturday he was there, even Sunday for a period of time, he was there as well. And so they go to anoint Jesus' body. And they're up early. They're up there, boy, they're out there as dawn. And they're looking at each other, realizing, who's going to roll that big stone away? And when they get there, of course, the stone's rolled away. And they go in and they're shocked. They're alarmed. They're like fearful. It's like, whoa, there's this young guy sitting there in white. Maybe that's Mark's way of saying this could be an angel. And anyway, he tells them, basically, it's okay. Don't be alarmed. You're looking for Jesus the Nazarene, but he's not here. He's risen. But by the way, go and look for yourself. You don't have to take my word for it. I want you to just go look and see for yourself. And so they look and they realize, there's no evidence of Jesus anywhere, and so they leave. But this young man, or this angel, says to them, I want you to go tell the disciples. I want you to go tell Peter. And I want you to tell them that Jesus is going ahead of them to Galilee, where he will see them. Right? That Jesus will keep his word. At the Last Supper, he's told you he was going to be crucified, he would be killed, but he would rise again, and then he would meet you in Galilee. And don't think that death will stop Jesus from keeping his word, because all of this is going to come to pass. And so, and I like how he not only says, go see the disciples, but it's like, as much as the disciples have fled, right? Peter, of course, went a whole nother level of betraying him and saying, I don't know him. And Peter is mentioned by name. And he tells them, right, tell them they're going to see Jesus. And the women are fearful. For the first time, we get this element of fear again with women this time. And they go and they flee from the tomb. And either they don't go anywhere for a while in terms of not telling anyone, or perhaps, as some would say, some of the women stayed in the area. They got out of the tomb, but they were too scared. They didn't want to say anything, where Mary Magdalene did at some point go. And so maybe for a while they didn't say anything, and then they calmed themselves down, and then they went and told the news. And of course we know that the disciples at first is like, they had trouble believing it as well. And I just wanted to for us to reflect on a couple of things in this story. And that is, first of all, that the resurrection of Jesus is not a hoax. It might have been considered conspiracy theory, but it was one that was true. It was the official story from the political, legal, judicial, religious experts that was the cover-up. They were trying to cover up how, in a sense, they're failures. On the other hand, the disciples and the women, they were just talking about their experience. And the story, and the way they told it, it really didn't lend credibility in many ways, in terms of they didn't make themselves look good. They didn't lend credibility because they used women, but that was, we know that Jesus had a heart for all people. And they did not intentionally plan on a narrative that went well in their favor. It made them look bad. And today, even today, when people examine the story and give it and do their research, they discover that the resurrection is weighty. The evidence, you might say, demands a verdict of it happened. Lee Strobel, who investigated the resurrection and investigated and talked to many experts, he wrote a book, The Case for Easter, which is a great book in terms of it's very readable, and if you have questions about it, it's a great little book to get that will help answer questions you might have about the resurrection of Jesus. And even today, atheists and agnostics, that some of them, I was just listening to one lady who was on a panel discussion with like people that are recognized as sort of the top atheists in terms of their popularity and arguing and so on, that as she dug into the weight of it, the evidence, she became a Christian. She started to follow Jesus because the evidence was there. The resurrection is not a hoax, it's the real thing. And not only is it a true story, it's a story of second chances. A story of being known for who you are with all your flaws. A story of being loved. A story of being forgiven. It's a story where they desert him, and yet when Jesus comes back from that, he goes looking for them, you might say. He shows up and he restores and he initiates a coming back together and restores relationship with them. And that same Jesus who had that heart and that heart for especially Peter, who had really gone out of his way to disconnect from Jesus. Jesus specifically, right? The angel specifically identifies Peter. You got to let him know, right? That because Peter, I'm sure, felt guilt. He felt shame. It's like, Jesus is looking for you. Jesus is going to find you. And Jesus gives us a second chance, as we talked about on Friday, right? The idea of rest, of lightening our burdens. And Jesus invites us to experience him in a relationship that provides rest, that he's gentle, that we don't need to fear or be alarmed, but that we can, in that Matthew language, right, to be yoked with him. That the one who conquered death is calling our name. And he's calling us, come follow. He's calling us to go deeper with him in the days ahead. And so as we move into these days after Easter, not only do we celebrate that Jesus is alive, that death has been conquered, but Jesus calls us to follow him and to find rest for our souls. Let us follow Jesus. Thanks for being with me.